Now, orthodoxy traditionally is Palamite. There are some modern Orthodox theologians who really want to be original and say, oh, no, no, we're not Palamite. It's like David Bentley Hart. But, I mean, David Bentley Hart is a great Roman Catholic theologian. He's not a great Orthodox theologian. But the Orthodox tradition is classically Palamite. In short, St. Gregory Palamas, following the fathers such as Maximus and Basil the Great, he taught that there was a real distinction between what God is and what God does. But what God is what constitutes him as God. What God does is his expressions of what he is outside of himself. And so it is the divine persons who energize or act, and their activity, their energy, reflects the divine nature, but it does not wholly circumscribe it. In other words, you cannot wholly and comprehensively express your nature through your energies. And we say that we only know God in his energies, but we don't just say that. We also say we only know other persons by their energies. We see that God's properties are energies. Now that might seem really unintuitive at first, but let's just think, how do we describe God? We describe him as loving, just, merciful. We say he does not clear the guilty, etc., etc. Why do we call him all these things? Well, these are energies. We say God is loving because he loves. He is just because he executes justice, and so on and so forth. This also applies to the way we speak about human persons. And we say with respect to the essence of God, we can't predicate affirmations of the essence. We can't predicate denials. And think about some of the classical attributes. God is timeless. Well, that doesn't mean that there's this positive attribute called timelessness, which we identify with God. Rather, timelessness means that in his essence, God altogether transcends the categories of time. We said that God is incorporeal. Well, incorporeality is not a positive attribute. It is a denial. It is apophatic theology. God altogether transcends what it means to have a body. And of course, in the incarnation, the Logos does take on a true body. But that is not with respect to his divine nature. It is with respect to his human nature, though by that union he communicates divine energies of the human nature, thus enabling our deification. And so that's the basic Palamite understanding of God. But what this does is it enables us to understand the mode in which God has genuine freedom. Because if God's activity is totally identical to what makes God God, what that means is that everything which God does, he does necessarily. In other words, because what God does is identical to what God is, for God to be God, he must have done exactly what he has done. He must have created the world because his activity is identical to what makes him God, and he has acted in creating the world. Now, this is not just some silly orthodox polemic. This is a genuine philosophical problem, which St. Thomas himself recognized. St. Thomas simply said, well, I appeal to mystery. Well, I think that's a bit of a cop-out, because mystery does not mean there is a genuine contradiction philosophically which we can then wave off. Mystery refers to when we can describe God, but of course the descriptions don't circumscribe him. And in a sense, he will always transcend those descriptions, even though they are objectively true. So that's a serious philosophical problem with absolute divine simplicity as understood in the Thomistic tradition. Because God's being is not identical to God's activity, we understand that God could have freely acted in a whole variety of ways. He could have acted in not creating the world. He had the genuine freedom to create the world, which makes it wholly an act of grace. And the energies themselves are distinguished from one another. They interpenetrate one another in an infinite amount of ways. But that infinite amount of ways is still limited. And you might be asking the question, well, how can that be? That sounds like a contradiction. How can it both be infinite and limited? Well, the analogy I would use is just to go to numbers. I'm a mathematical realist, mathematical Platonist, and I think the numbers are a wonderful way. They are truly an expression of the energies of God, because The energies of God, the Logos is called the Logos in virtue of the Father always energizing in the Son, so all the energies are summed up in him. And mathematics captures many truths about the divine energies. So think about numbers. There are an infinite number of ways that you can permute numbers with one another. There are an infinite number of ways you can multiply numbers with one another, given that the amount of numbers are infinite, and you can multiply any number by any other number. But it's also limited in the sense that 2 times 2 is always going to equal 4. Even though the amount of possible permutations of those numbers is infinite, there are still some permutations which are non-existent. So that's what I mean when I say God's energies are infinite, and they are also limited. They interpenetrate in an infinite variety of ways. I'm sorry if this is getting kind of dense. I have articles on this as well. I would also say that mathematics and the real world is filled with fractals. There are genuine fractals in the concrete visible creation. And in the abstract world of mathematics, there are many, many fractals as well. And indeed, when you project those fractals out in an image, just from the abstract world, it looks very much like fractals in the real world, which indicates, I believe, that the real world is actually based on this plan in the mind of God, whom we call the Logos. Now, in case you don't know what a fractal is when you have a thing and you look deeper inside the thing, you find it's composed of littler versions of itself. If that's confusing, just Google it. But God's energies are also fractal. So one of God's energies is love, but there are an infinite number of particular forms of God's love, which are timeless. We should also understand the energies are Trinitarian. The Father eternally loves the Son, and the Son eternally loves the Father back, and the Spirit eternally carries the love of Father and Son to one another. They are always expressed towards another person. And we say that the energies are expressions of God's essence or being, but they do not wholly contain it. Now, importantly, we also say that there are contingent manifestations of the energies, which St. Gregory Palamas says this is the sense in which we can speak of created energies. The analogy he uses, or that David Bradshaw uses, which I've described before, is that of love. A husband loves his wife from day to day. It's the same energy from day to day. But there are different ways of expressing that energy to her. One day he may buy her flowers. The next day he may give her chocolate. Next day he may take her on a vacation. Gets very expensive, but these are different manifestations of the same energy. And so there is not an eternal energy of God called creation, because God actively chose to create the world, but creation is a contingent expression of God's timeless energies. And that's why we say, by the way, that God's love is more ultimate than his judgment. Because God's judgment, God's wrath, is not eternal. The 3 persons of the Trinity aren't wrathful towards one another. God's wrath is a contingent expression of his desire to cleanse the world and uphold the world and be faithful to his world. It is a contingent expression of that in response to particular realities in the world, in the creation.